You know that rare moment when someone says something so calm and so perfectly timed that it flips the entire room without raising their voice even slightly? That is exactly what happened here. And the reaction that came right after is the reason everybody is still talking about it. Was it a planned move, or did Trump accidentally walk straight into a line he never saw coming? Because whatever that moment was, it did not just land, it changed the whole energy of the room. And once you witness it, you genuinely cannot stop watching. Nobody turns on a political broadcast expecting something that feels less like a policy conversation and more like a perfectly placed plot twist in a story that has been building for years. But that is exactly what played out when Barack Obama calmly delivered a line that landed with almost surgical precision, and Donald Trump, a man who is almost never short on confidence or quick responses, found himself reacting in a way that viewers could only describe as strangely unsettled. But the real story here is not just about one comment or one quick reaction. It is about the long, complicated, genuinely messy history between two political figures who have spent years circling each other like rival forces, fighting for control of the same narrative. Each one fully convinced the other represents everything wrong with where modern leadership has ended up. What most people think they know about these two is surprisingly simple, almost too simple to match the actual story. One is usually painted as the calm, polished statesman who chooses his words carefully and never lets the surface crack. The other is seen as the unpredictable disruptor who lives for breaking the rules and dominating the headlines through sheer force of presence. But that moment hit differently, and to really understand why, you have to rewind the timeline a little, because the tension between them did not appear out of nowhere. Years before rallies and televised debates turned them into obvious rivals, there was already a simmering conflict that began when Donald Trump publicly questioned Barack Obama's legitimacy through the now infamous birther narrative. It was a move that many analysts still point to as the opening scene of a rivalry that would stretch across presidencies, reshape political storytelling, and never really stop. At the time, it felt like just another loud media controversy. But looking back, it was the spark that lit something neither man has ever fully put out. Fast forward to the era of non-stop televised commentary, where every word gets analyzed instantly and every facial expression becomes a meme within minutes, and you start to understand why this particular exchange carried so much weight. Barack Obama, known for his controlled delivery and carefully chosen phrasing, does not usually step into personal confrontations unless he is making a much bigger point. And that is precisely why the way he framed his critique stood out so sharply against everything surrounding it. Instead of firing off personal insults or going after Trump directly, he leaned into larger themes: leadership, responsibility, the long-term damage that certain political choices leave behind long after the news cycle moves on. He talked about the importance of truth in public office, the dangers of misinformation, the need for leaders to put the country above their personal storylines. And he did all of it while staying so composed that it felt less like a response to Trump and more like a message aimed directly at a much bigger audience beyond the room. For viewers expecting a typical back-and-forth fight, this approach created a completely different kind of tension because it shifted the focus away from petty conflict and towards something deeper and genuinely more powerful. It was not about winning a quick moment or scoring cheap points in front of cameras. It was about controlling how the moment would be remembered afterward, and that is where the real battle in modern politics almost always happens. In a media world driven entirely by clips and sound bites and 2-second headlines, being able to deliver a message that sticks after the broadcast ends is a serious weapon. Obama seemed to understand exactly what he was doing with the timing, the framing, and the delivery. And Trump's response played out in a way that surprised a lot of people. Not because he stayed silent, but because the timing and tone of his reaction felt different from the usual pattern. There was a noticeable shift in his posture, almost like the conversation had moved onto ground that felt unfamiliar or somehow uncomfortable for him in ways that were difficult to immediately identify. Some people interpreted it as frustration. Others thought it was a calculated pause. But either way, it added another layer of complexity to an exchange that was already carrying more weight than a typical moment from a typical broadcast. The contrast between Obama's steady, almost unhurried delivery and Trump's more reactive energy created a dynamic that felt almost cinematic, like two completely different storytelling styles colliding in real time, and each one revealing something true about the person standing behind it. What makes moments like this so interesting is not only what happens inside the room, but the ripple effect that follows within minutes. Because almost immediately, the clips start moving across every platform. Commentators begin breaking down every word and every pause. Audiences pick sides with the same intensity usually reserved for sports rivalries. In this case, the narrative split fast. Some praising Obama for his composure, his clarity, and the precision of his framing. Others defending Trump's response as entirely consistent with his larger strategy of challenging the entire political system from the outside rather than working from within it. And that is exactly where the story stops being about one exchange and starts being about the changing nature of political communication itself, because both men represent genuinely different ways of connecting with the public, and both of those ways have proven effective in different contexts and for different audiences. Obama's approach leans towards structure, clarity, and a kind of steady confidence that appeals to people who want measured leadership from someone who appears to be in full control of the moment. Trump's approach feeds off disruption, emotional immediacy, and the energy that comes from making people feel like something unpredictable could happen at any second. When those two styles collide, it becomes less about who said the better line and more about what kind of leadership people personally trust. And that is why a single sentence can explode into hours of debate, endless headlines, and arguments that go on long after everyone has agreed to stop, even though the real impact is almost always far more complicated than any simple victory or loss could capture. As things started to cool down, analysts began stepping back and looking at the broader picture, asking whether this moment signaled something larger about how major political figures engage with each other in public spaces. Some argued Obama demonstrated how powerful it can be to stay composed and focus on themes that outlast the moment. Others pointed out that moments like this never happen in a vacuum. They build over years. The history between these two gave the exchange extra meaning. The setting added urgency, and their completely different styles added the kind of drama that turns a single broadcast exchange into a cultural event that keeps resurfacing in new contexts for months afterward. But maybe the most interesting part is how this moment will be remembered years from now, because political history is shaped not only by laws and decisions, but by the stories people tell about them afterward. In the days that followed, different groups created entirely different versions of what happened, each focusing on different details and walking away with different conclusions. And that is the real reminder that in modern politics, perception carries just as much power as reality, sometimes more. There is also a strange irony in how this exchange played out, because it highlighted the very thing both men have spent years trying to control: the narrative around their leadership. As viewers kept replaying the clip, analyzing reactions, and arguing about what it all meant, one thing became clearer with each viewing. Moments like this never exist on their own. They are part of a much larger story about how political figures communicate, how audiences interpret what they hear, and how the media transforms a single exchange into something that takes on a life entirely separate from the original event. Whether people saw Obama's line as a carefully aimed critique or Trump's response as a quick strategic adjustment, the moment offered a genuine glimpse into how complicated modern political communication has become, where every interaction carries the potential to turn into a defining scene. And every defining scene adds another chapter to a story that was already layered and dramatic long before the cameras turned on that day. What made the aftermath even more interesting was how quickly the conversation shifted from what was actually said to what people believed was meant underneath it. Audiences were not just listening anymore. They were decoding intentions, studying body language, judging the pauses, and analyzing the timing like amateur detectives working a case they are convinced has a hidden layer. Within hours, commentators across different platforms were constructing completely different versions of the same moment, almost like they were watching different edits of the same film, and every version arrived with its own conclusion about who actually controlled the narrative. Trump's supporters argued that his reaction was entirely consistent with his style and proved his strength and willingness to stand his ground, while others believed the moment exposed something more significant than a standard political disagreement. And that split is exactly what made the exchange so compelling, because it refused to settle into one clean explanation. It kept inviting debate, which is the exact kind of outcome that keeps political storylines alive and circulating long after the original moment has technically ended. On the other side, Obama's approach continues to be analyzed as a model for how to land a point without giving the other person an obvious target to swing back at. By keeping the critique elevated and focused on principles rather than personality, he made it genuinely difficult to respond effectively without appearing to confirm the thing being criticized. It is one thing to argue against a statement directly. It is another thing entirely to change the frame the statement sits inside. And that is a fundamentally different kind of political move, one that operates more slowly but tends to stick much longer. As the discussion deepened, some observers also pointed out that this moment reflects a generational shift in political communication, where the battle is no longer limited to speeches and press conferences, but stretches into an endless real-time conversation fueled by social media, instant reactions, and an audience that never fully switches off. In that environment, the ability to deliver a line that sticks beyond the immediate audience becomes its own form of influence. And both Obama and Trump have demonstrated in completely different ways that they understand how to operate inside that system, even when they approach it from opposite directions. Timing also matters more than most people fully appreciate. Moments like this do not hit the same way if they arrive in isolation. The political climate leading up to the exchange, the expectations built around both men, and the audience's awareness of their shared history all shaped how the interaction was received and interpreted. It was not a random clash. It was a moment built on years of accumulated tension, finally finding a precise and public outlet. And the question that keeps pulling people back to the clip is whether this was a carefully planned move or a genuinely spontaneous moment that just happened to carry enormous weight. The answer depends entirely on who you ask. Some believe Obama's delivery was far too sharp and precise to be accidental, while others argue that his natural speaking style makes even unplanned moments feel deliberate. And that uncertainty, the fact that the question stays open, is actually part of what keeps the moment alive. As the clip keeps circulating and resurfacing in new contexts, it becomes a reminder of something true about modern politics that gets more relevant with every passing news cycle. Stories are not finished when the cameras stop. They are just beginning. One exchange can take on an entirely separate life, shifting slightly with every retelling, picking up new layers of meaning depending on who is watching and what they are already looking for. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, the original moment still sits there, unchanged, quietly carrying just enough room for interpretation, because that space is exactly where curiosity grows, where arguments get louder, and where audiences keep coming back, genuinely convinced there is something they missed the first time around.